Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Schools Forum for this meeting today. So if we run through apologies for absence, James.
Through you, Chair, we have apologies for absence from Karen Lewis with Tracy Carter substituting, and also from Lee Hughes.
Super, thank you. And James, you want to run through forum changes?
Yes, so through you, Chair, we have had a resignation at the end of 2023 from Becky Merritt as maintained nursery representative. So we're in the process of reaching out to the sector to try and fill that vacancy. Also have a resignation from Rod Warsap as an academy maintained representative. And again, we advertised the availability of places for academy representatives on the Schools Forum at the end of last year. And then thirdly, Jenny Thorpe has resigned as the 16-19 representative. And after discussion with the sector, Thomas Goodridge has come forward to take that position. So, and he's in attendance today. So welcome to his first Schools Forum meeting.
Thank you, James. Yes, Thomas and Tracy, welcome to the Schools Forum. And we look forward to you joining us and as representatives for the sectors. Declarations of interest. Has anyone got any declarations of interests relating to the agenda items at all that haven't been declared, or the nature of the interest? Or if something comes up during the agenda items, if you mention any declarations you have at that point, if there's something that you haven't thought of to start with? No? Okay. So can we look at the minutes? You've had an opportunity the minutes have been circulated. And are there any, there's a couple of action points I think I wanted to go through, but are there any points on the accuracy of the minutes first? No. Okay. And so there were a couple of resolutions, I think, from there. All points I wanted to ask. I think we can sign the minutes. On the minutes on point 6, which is on page 8 of the pack, we talked about they would look to see the impact of implementing the split site policy on the national funding formula. Did you identify any adverse impact of implementing the split site policy?
It was a mixture of all of the increases that were still causing a cap on one particular school that's a very high percentage of their budget, but there isn't anything that we can undo within the national funding formula that completely solves that problem for that school. So there is one particular small school who is a split site school who is receiving a high cap as a percentage of their budget through all of their increases.
Okay, okay, but we don't feel there's anything much we can do to change the way that we implement.
The sort of options available to change that would be to take all of the premises factors, the PFI and the split site, outside of the minimum funding guarantee, which would mean those would be outside of the capping in the school's funding formula. To do that, we would have to get full consultation with all of the schools, bring that back, have a vote in Schools Forum, and then ask for a ministerial disapplication of the rules to allow us to do that. So within the timeframes that we've got, which that kind of process could happen for 25-26 budgets, but unfortunately not now for 24-25 budgets.
Okay, I think if forum members agree, it's something that for the next funding year would be worth looking at when we go to consultation, where we are putting proposals out just for where there is a real adverse impact. So that the consultation and then forum have an opportunity to look at that and see where there's any tweaks we need to do in the following funding year.
That's right. I did ask the SFA if we can apply it to one school, because there's one school more heavily affected and we're not allowed to. It has to be a flat formula change that's applicable to all schools. We can't just sort of cherry pick,
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Okay, if we pick that up for next funding year with the consultations. The other one was we resolved when it comes to early years funding that we would draw the Department for Education's attention to the challenges facing the early years providers. I know we're coming into early years, but have we done that? Did we get any response?
Chair, we did send that letter, and thank you for your comments on that as well. I've got a meeting at 4:30 today with the DFE, and this is on the agenda.
Right.
I don't expect to get a full response, but I will. So if we're still running, I will have to escape just before 4:30. As soon as we get an update, I'll let you know, and I'll let all members know as well.
Yeah, no, that would be great if we can do that. I think those were the areas that I'd picked out. If no one else has picked anything out, then we're happy to approve the minutes and move on. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Right. The ever perennial issue of election of a vice chair. We've been underwhelmed by nominees. So I'll ask again this time round, because we're running out of meetings to elect a vice chair for this year. We'll soon be into the next year. I think we probably got, is this the last meeting?
This is the last meeting, unless the need for another one arises.
Okay. Anyone for this year want to stand for vice chair? Go on then, but yes, yeah. So Peter, if you're happy to nominate for vice chair, that'll. No, no. I'm happy to second or to promote that. Seconded or have a vote on that. Yeah. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, everyone happy with that? Thank you, Peter. Right, Rihanna, early years funding. Would you like to take us through your paper?
Thank you. We're going to do a bit of a double act. So I think, have you all met Rihanna? Probably worth an introduction.
Hello, my name's Rahana Kareem. I'm the early years lead at West Northampton. Rahana Kareem, early years lead at West Northampton. Nice to meet you all.
So Rihanna's worked with us to look at the modelling. So we had the very late early years DSG settlement for early years. Normally, if it's sort of in the early autumn, we can do some modelling and get some figures to schools forum for the December meeting, but it came out too late for us to meet the December meeting, which unfortunately meant we had to do the consultation sort of as soon as we came back in the new year, so early in January. So that has gone out and written by Rihanna with my modelling for the forecast hours that we're likely to be, the difference between the hours that we're funded as compared to the hours that settings claim. So that's what's gone into the consultation. And Rihanna's going to bring back the results for that consultation to make the votes on that budget.
So the key questions that we asked in the consultation were in relation to. Sorry, can you get that?
They need to be quite close.
Okay. Okay, so as part of the earliest consultation question, we had 6 questions. The first one was around the support for the LA's proposed increase to their base rate for the 2-year-old entitlement to £7.37. The results of that you can see in your main document. Unanimously, there was agreement for that rate to be increased to £7.37. I think in total, we had 79% saying yes. The second question was in relation to agreeing the same funding rate for the 2-year-old disadvantage entitlement and the 2-year-old working families entitlement. Again, the results for that particular sort of feedback from the sector was unanimously 78% agreed to there being a rate that's equal for both 2-year-old funding rates. The third question, which was in seeking agreement to continue to support the arrangements of West Northants Council retaining 5% of the early years central funding. And this was based on taking 5% just from the 3 and 4-year-old funded entitlement allocation. The results were as follows. In terms of yes, we had 35% agreed, 39%, 42%, sorry, said no, and there was no opinion for an additional 23%. So there wasn't a unanimous yes, although we would say that based on the non-opinions, 35 and 23, so that 59%, it was sort of would say that it was slightly with the yes kind of response. So that's been, if I hand over to Ben's just going to expand a little bit on that.
Chair, is it okay if I just contribute on this bit in particular? And actually, I should have contributed earlier. Firstly, to introduce Ray properly, Ray's joined the team and is leading the early years team, has a massive amount of experience and knowledge around early years. One of the discussions we had this time last year was about us disaggregating our early years service from Northampton, actually building our own team. We haven't got to the end of that yet. We've got a lot of the way through. Getting Ray in as the manager of that service and then populating that service underneath is really critical, we believe, to be able to support and serve the early years sector. On this particular response, I just wanted to add my view there, and I'm happy to take sort of full responsibility of this. Nearly 1 in 4 people have come back to this response and said, I've got no opinion. That for me says we haven't articulated it clearly enough. So there's something for me about the clarity in the consultation. That's our job to take that away and think about how we do that in a lot clearer way next year. Because I think for 25% of people to go all the way through and tick, I'm not sure, means we haven't set it out well enough. That's my view. So I do think, well, not I think, we will take that away and we will think about how we consult in a clearer way, hopefully with more timely information from the DFE. I just wanted to support Ray's point as well. 42% saying no. I think there is a remit to continue with what we're doing here. We need to be much clearer with the sector about the impact of what we're doing. That's my bit. Sorry, Ray, just wanted to chip in.
No, and I suppose from my point of view, coming in, I think I've only been in post 5 months. We're still at a point where we're establishing a team. What I can see from my experience, there's certain statutory duties that are lapsed or not being done, and around, say, auditing of provisions and in line with the statutory guidance and our local authorities sort of compliance processes, where I'm trying to embed some of that, and that 5% takes in account the fact that we need that additional capacity for the expansion program that we are rolling out as part of the government's initiative, but also moving and transitioning what is our current systems, which are quite manual and old IT systems, to a whole kind of transformation. So there's lots of different elements around its infrastructure that we're also supporting as part of this process. In the few months that I've been in post, we've worked really hard to sort of look at the consultation around targeted SEND funding, putting new application forms in place, working very closely with the sector to be able to co-produce some of the guidance, etc. And as part of this consultation, we've also looked at hearing what the sector's saying around targeted SEND funding rates, and have proposed an increase by 25% for the targeted SEND fund rate, which has been really well received as part of the consultation. I just feel like at this stage, we're trying to get SEND, safeguarding, and confidence within the sector and practitioner level. We're trying to embed some of that. And so that 5% is really integral to us setting that up within West Northants and continue to sort of an upward trajectory for us. So that was just the other point I wanted to make. So if I can continue, I suppose the next question related to the 5% is obviously our question around asking the sector about them supporting the local authorities proposal to increase the base rate for the 3 and 4-year-old universal and extended rate to £4.93. And the response for that, as you can imagine, has been linked to the other question. In terms of yes, we've had 46% agree, 50% say no, and again, no opinion of 4%. So it's just linked to that, and I just highlighting that. And I suppose the final question that we asked was what I've already alluded to, was asking the sector about the increased rate, the hourly rate for the early years targeted SEND funding from £8 to £10 from April 2024. And that has had a 69% support with a yes, 70% no, and 13% no opinion, and no comment with 1%. So that has been well received as well. Then at the findings from the consultation.
Okay, I want to open it up to questions, but I think just to summarize, generally, reading through the paper, the consultation came back that the rates around the 2-year-olds and the increase in the SEND funding, everyone's quite happy with. The bit that I think we need probably to unpick and want to have a discussion around is the 3 and 4-year rate and the essential top slicing of that, the retention of that. Rachel, you start. Yeah.
So I think first of all, it's worth noting that this year has been brilliant with responses. 94 is kind of the most we've ever had. And I think that is to do with the increased engagement with the sector. So I do think, you know, we agreed last year to a 5% retention on the on central expenditure, and I think that is having an impact. The consultation results, unfortunately, has kind of thrown a spanner in the works because, you know, we're here representing the sector, and, you know, I think, yes, despite the fact that 23 have no opinion, overall, I think 42 saying that they don't agree with the 5% is hugely concerning, and it's something that we really need to, you know, address. I think starting there kind of thing, I think the sector needs to have a better understanding of where that central expenditure is going. And I feel very torn at this point, and you know, I'm hoping that forum members can perhaps help, you know, as well, to unpick this. But it's very difficult to kind of make a decision on something that that we don't know the full picture for, and that full impact as well. And I've had conversations with Rahana and Ben, and just kind of, from my point of view, thinking about even if they reduce to kind of 4% rather than that 5%, you know, and that, you know, additional, how much is that going to be on the base rate? And I think it's, you know, there are a lot of settings that only take 3 and 4-year-olds. So we kind of have to almost discount the 2-year funding because that can't offset costs in some settings. And for the 3 and 4-year-old base rate, you know, we are struggling, you know, and we are very different. We're a very different sector to primary and secondary and further education, where our staff are paid on minimum wage, you know, because we haven't got the funding to pay them more. And it is soul destroying as a business owner that I can't pay them more. And we're stuck between a hard place and a rock because, you know, we're not funded enough. We can't pass costs on to parents, and that cost is unfortunately at the business owner or the charitable setting to raise monies to support these children in our settings. National minimum wage is going up another £1 in April, and, you know, even if that 1%, I don't know how much it is. This is I'm pulling, you know, figures from the air, but even if it is 5p extra on a base rate for a business like myself, that's an extra 2-3 grand a year, which would pay them for my staff increase costs. So at this point, you know, it's a real difficult thing. I wanted to kind of also talk about like comments, you know, and raise concerns over that sustainability of the early years sector. I think it's been, you know, raised quite a few times, and you know, there was a meeting this morning with the sector, and they were saying, you know, we can't keep putting the costs of underfunding. I realise that it is a national issue, but if there's anything that we can do now to, you know, help providers, then I feel that we should. And you can't have, the thing is, there has been a lot of talk in the sector about not accepting funded children, because we can't keep doing that. I've spoken to many providers about that issue, and as a whole sector, are we going to stand against the government and say, no, we're not going to do it, and we're just going to have private paying customers? Which then, you know, the thing is, as a local authority, you can't have one without the other. You know, you need a working childcare force for the children in your local authority. We're providing it, and unfortunately we're providing it at the detriment of our workforce and you know, our businesses. And
there's a couple of points there that Rachel, you've raised, and it follows on. I went through the paper in some detail, and I wanted to hear your comments back on them first. But I think that is one thing that is quite helpful, is if there is only modelling on a 5%, so what difference does it make if it's dropped down to 4%? So now I'm assuming that your £4.93 rate, effectively, if you're taking 5% off, is essentially 95%. So when I did some modelling, I modelled it based on 3%. If you reduced it to 3% and come in at 5.18, now that's just pragmatic modelling, but I'm sure you have some modelling that's, or can do some modelling that's a little bit more. So at 4%, it's going to be somewhere in between, isn't it? It's going to be somewhere just over the £5 mark, I would say. So, which could potentially make quite a bit of difference. The other one that I don't think I could find in here, I can see that we have in the early years budget breakdown, I think 1.3 million for 24-25 with a 5%. What I couldn't see in the paper is what the current year's budget is, or what the current year's forecast is as an equivalent number. Because again, because the rates have gone up, you'd expect that to be, I think it would come in somewhere around, well, it would come in somewhere a bit less than that, because that 1.39 has gone up, but I couldn't see that quite as easily. But again, when I was just playing around with some numbers, I'd come back to if you did, if you knock 2% out, it's about 400 odd thousand. So half of that 200,000, you'd still have well over 1 million. And I think when I was reading, and I don't want to jump ahead to another paper, but I think we have got an underspend, because you mentioned about the vacancies. So we've got an underspend. We will be putting more money aside. A very good point about the impact, and I think communicating to the sector what the impact is and what's happening with it's also good. But also what would happen if what would the effect be, if we went to a 4% instead of 5%? And are my numbers horribly wrong or reasonable?
We have done that modelling to show sort of what the impact of the 5%. We haven't got it in front of us. What sort of various reductions on that 5% would mean. We were sort of looking at it that maybe it was more of a shift between, instead of doing 0% on the 2-year-olds and 9 months to 2-year-olds, instead of doing 0% on those, that if we which means that we're not essentially not receiving £792,000 for our central pot, which is now part of the formula that we're allowed to take, but we've taken zero. If it's a shift between the 3 and 4 year olds of 5% to something on the 2 year olds, which perhaps supports those settings who only have 3 and 4 year olds, then perhaps that would be something, but we haven't got modelling to show you what the impact would be because we haven't had that request.
No, I think obviously the issue then, if you start taking off something from the 2 year olds where your ratios are much higher, then that's going to start to make things even more difficult, isn't it, for those settings as well.
Just to say, and that was probably around the rationale around not taking the 5% from there, and also the fact that for the 2 year olds, these are based on DfE's estimates. We're going to have to submit additional headcounts throughout the year in order while they're doing their modelling around the 2 year old rate and the 2 year old as well.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'll say just in summary is the one point I had made about it is whatever way we look at it, and this comes back to the point we were making before, there simply isn't enough cash in the pot, however you carve it up, to be able to bring wages up above minimum wage, to be able to give a sustainable living, an ability to deliver for the early year settings. And so from Forum's point of view, other than the lobbying which we're doing, we've talked about that, and seeing how the settlements come out, the only lever we have to pull to try and get more money into the settings to make that sustainable, as far as I can see it as Schools Forum, is that margin. I don't think we have any other tools in our box that we can do anything else with. So I'll open the questions up again, but that seems to be where the Schools Forum want to request that modelling or make a different decision. Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. There isn't enough money, but we're all in that, same boat, aren't we? In education. I had just had a brief conversation with Ben around, thinking about that 4% for the next year, and then we're getting new rates again, and we look at it from a year by year kind of thing. And like you said, and we had an underspend, so offsetting those costs of the positions that haven't been filled over this year. And I feel, if from my opinion, we've been a hurt sector for a long time, and if we can actually listen to what the sector is asking, I think it would go a long way.
I think as well, just to add on to that, with that understanding, if it could come back into the sector, because we're not only going through this, we're also going through a recruitment crisis. So we're also not attracting the field. So we're talking about sustainability and keeping the sector going for working families, which is what we want to do. We all get the government agenda and believe in it. But we're looking at settings that are closing with like days notice. They're just going. It's not, it's not like it was before that we've got this warning signs and we can step in. So I think there's something to think about that as well. I know that the DfE are trying to do stuff around recruitment, but we're not seeing it on the ground yet. So I think that we are getting to a real crisis point that, we need to look at that.
Respond to a couple. There's a couple of bits in the conversation, and I think I've got a suggestion that might move us on. Absolutely share that, the pressure out there at the moment. The irony that we get is the DfE say there's a problem with recruitment and then say, what are we doing about it? And we get that pressure, which we know, and you get that pressure as well. And a lot of that, and I'm really pleased, Rachel, if I go back to your first comments, to say you can see the impact coming already. And I'd like to think that the 94 responses, that increased engagement, is largely down to your engagement here, but is also by having a team behind, a team that are sitting centrally behind. So I think the message is getting out there. We'll keep lobbying the sector. We'll keep doing what we can do. And we have to, and I know from Fiona, on behalf of the council politically and as officers, we are really trying to prioritise early years and get it right. We know we've got to do it. That's why we're trying to build that team. So if I talk about the money that's gone into the team, I think as long as finance colleagues tell me I'm allowed to do this, any underspend that we've got for the current year should go back out to the sector. That's the right thing to do. There have been some issues around recruitment in terms of it's taken longer than we hoped, in terms of we've run recruitment and not had the right quality of candidates. So we've gone back out again. That causes delays. So the underspend that we've got this year, as long as we can, in line with the finance regs, I think it's absolutely right. We put that straight back out and we flushed it out through the local sector to put the money back out. Because that funding that we are looking to centrally retain, and at the moment it's 5% of the 3 and 4s and nothing on the other element, about 99.9% of that funding is either tied up in the system that we use to track and to make payments and to do the work we need to do, or people. Having the variability of going 4% one year, 5% next year, all that will mean is that we can offer 1 year fixed term contracts to people and we'll make people redundant every year, which I don't think brings any stability into the service that we want. So for me, the plea is to have a 3 year, I know we can't agree things in 3 years because we do it annually, but to be able to build and have a chance at having that team really getting in and working with you guys to make the difference it needs to make. So for me, some stability and being able to recruit a team will make a massive impact rather than one year. You know, we're not going to get the candidates we need if we're advertising 1 year fixed term jobs that are subject to review every year and that we might not be able to renew. We're just not going to get the right people to come and help lead and work with Ray. So that, I think that would be that. If people are happy with that suggestion, any underspend, we get it straight out, every penny, and then we carry on, and then we can fully recruit and get that team built up behind the scenes. And then through next year, we look at, should it be 3.5% on 3s and 4s and 2s? What does that look like and how will that work? I don't know if that is a pragmatic solution or not. And just the last thing to say, the challenge for us is, you're right, there is no other way to do this. So the ability to do that 5% top slice is to enable councils to have that central hub, not just that make payments, but that can do all that advice, that support, that trying to drum up more interest, trying to help recruitment. Without that, we can't do any of that at all, which leaves the sector struggling to run the day job and try and do everything else with that coordination role. That's what we're trying to do with that centrally retained funding, is provide that central hub that can really support and challenge and lead the sector. That's what we want to do.
Okay. Beth, can I just ask, the early years is a block, isn't it? So any balance on that block, any let's say underspends in the current year will carry forward and be available as part of that block for future years.
Yeah, we can choose to do that. At the moment, we aren't under any kind of DSG deficit recovery plan where the government wouldn't be looking by block, I don't believe. We haven't been in that situation yet, but we're not in that position at the moment, so it would be for us to be able to ring fence it.
Hayley.
I just wanted to come back, and I, totally hear everything that you're saying, and, fair. The only thing I wanted to just say on the temporary contract, the only backside of it is we're then left in a position that we're recruiting staff on annual temporary contracts because we've not got that kind of guarantee. So it's almost like it comes back onto the sector. We're then not getting effective staff. We've got that onset of kind of each year we're having to do DBSs, all of that recruitment process costs money. So I just want, and I think that I'm speaking for the sector, that we're all struggling with that too. And obviously we're attracting the wrong kind of candidates into the sector. So it's just that, again, just keep going back to that sustainability part, which I think is really important. So I do hear that there's only a pot, but just to try and give the sector's views on that as well.
Yeah, please.
Hayley, I hear that 100%. And I would love to be able to get 3-year settlements or 5-year settlements because it enables us all to budget, to grow, to do things properly. At the moment, we're not going to get that. We're going to get this annual washing machine that we get thrown into. That's the way we all have to work, isn't it? But I do hear that, and I think that message from the sector and supported by the council as well, we need to keep lobbying with that message around clarity, because you're right, if we want to get the very best people, we need to give them that guarantee of work, don't we?
Peter.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not an expert on this at all, but just 2 or 3 points I'd just like to make. The first one is just a comment, really, and that's not a criticism of any of the people to my left at all. But you know, to have people on national minimum wage looking after our preschool children is shocking. You know, that we've seen with COVID how important that is, that development stage is, and that's not a criticism, that's just, you know, it's really a comment. And I think we're in a serious situation now because, I mean, I live on Grange Park as it happens, and I know that the preschool on Grange Park, which gets funding from, as I say, I don't really understand the whole system, but my understanding is it gets funding through the government scheme, is shutting after years and years because it just can't afford to keep going. And the private provider on Grange Park is staying open because it can charge whatever it wants to parents who can pay. So there's clearly something wrong with the system. And I hear that you're lobbying, and I think that's absolutely right to lobby. That's, again, I could be wrong with that. That's just my understanding of the system. And the final point I just wanted to make was all this top slicing, essentially, which is what it is, the 5%. I chair lots of academy trusts, and that's kind of what they do. They top slice, you know, and you think the schools are going to moan about that. And the only way schools don't moan about that is if you can demonstrate the impact of the top slice. And to my mind, just from hearing the discussion, I could be wrong, to my mind, because you've only just started, you are making an impact, but is it a demonstrable impact? And I just wonder whether part of our strategy going forward might be to say, okay, 4% this year, looking towards 5% next year, once we can demonstrate the impact that we're making, so that the sector can be brought alongside. Those are just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
As Ben has said, I have done a lot of lobbying myself, but I'm going to suggest that Ben and I meet with you two ladies to actually discuss how you can join in our lobbying conversation. Particularly, I'm going to say with our MP for this area, who is actually 0 to 5-year-old person. So let's get a conversation between the four of us. All I want to say is that we have had many, many things in our council where I think at the end of the organisation where we all split, lots of things that were kind of left over got either placed in one council or another. We know that our way of working in the West is completely different to the way of working in the North. And our team supporting you have been there. And what we are doing now is bringing our own team here so that you know them all. They're on hand all the time for you to get in contact with. And as you say, the communication has improved, but we haven't actually got the whole setup yet because that's what we're asking for the top slides for. So I've been with you a long time, haven't I? I fully understand and accept that you have been an ignored sector. And I agree with you that a lot of places we've visited them are just saying we're not going to take 2-year-olds because of this, that, and the other, unless it's a private nursery. So we fully understand your point of view. I think we need to do more consultation with you about explaining what we're going to do and how that will support you and help you in the future. But I think in the meantime, we need to get together with our lobbying. So we'll set something up to meet with you out of here.
Yeah, I think that would be most welcome. Are there any more questions for a minute? Beth, if we have a vote before us, and the proposition is for the one of them, which is the one that's the most controversial ones. I think there's unanimous agreement on the rest, is to take 95% of retain 5% fundamentally. Forum could decide to vote for that, or could, as far as I'm aware, James, decide to vote for something different, having listened to the consultation. If we were to go down and say, well, we would prefer to vote for 96% funded, 4% held centrally, and the carry forward from this year used to fund that gap. So I think the numbers will be pretty close. The savings on this year potentially to fund the gap for next year, and then look at 5% thereafter. Once we've once we've been able to explain to the sector the reasoning, how much of an issue do you think that would raise?
I'm looking left
Yeah.
at the brains who do the numbers over there, and I'll ask you two to come in a sec. I think the question, just so I'm clear in my head, Paul, having one of those afternoons. So if the shortfall this year is the difference between 4% and 5%, then it balances itself out for next year.
Yeah.
And then we go back to lots more work with the sector and then explaining what we do with it, and we get back to 5%. Personally, I'm very happy with that, because I think what that does, we flush some funding out now, fine. What it doesn't mean is Rayhana's just recruiting a new team and she immediately has to get rid
No.
of some of them, because we're just getting some
Yeah.
more people in board. So I think that gives us that stability and that continuity through it, as long as from finance colleagues, it works in terms of what we can and can't do. So I think it's a sensible idea.
We don't see any problem with that approach. That should be.
Sorry, Chair, just a very quick one, just an observation. There almost seems like an element of negotiation going on at the moment, isn't there? And I guess the problem is that as representatives, those parties that have voted for this are not part of this negotiation, are they? And therefore, how are we as a representative to know what they're thinking about the potential deal that is on the table? And I think that's the concern here, isn't it? Because we've gone from 5% to 4% to using the underspend to offset percentage difference and so on. Lots of numbers are being thrown around, but from what I can see, the percentage still remains the same. 42% say no. So the difficulty is that you're being asked to make a decision against a deal that you didn't know about. So again, just a comment, not necessarily anything
Can I make
beyond
a
that.
comment?
Yes, please.
I do understand what you're saying, but by going down to 4%, that's quite significant to the services that we can provide, unless there is an underspend, which might not be there. An alternative is that you don't go with the 5%, and if you look at the schools forum powers and responsibilities, the ESFA adjudicate. So if we could be saying, no, we need 5%, we could be sort of saying, you know, we absolutely can't do without that 5%. If you don't agree with that vote, we go to the ESFA, and it's within the regulations that 5% is can be taken from 3 and 4-year-olds and 2-year-olds, which is £790,000 we're not taking. So you're saying it's a negotiation. Yeah, it's a negotiation, but it's less than we've requested, is what we're happy to agree with, to try and help the sector, because we understand the situation. We're not saying we're going to, we need that 5% no matter what. We'll go to the ESFA and ask for them to vote on it. Give their.
Can I just ask James, and then Hay?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it was on a similar point to Beth has just raised. So the schools forum powers and responsibilities document sets out for the function of central spend on early years block provision. The local authority proposes, the schools forum decides, and then the DFE has the role of adjudicating where schools forum does not agree the local authority proposal. Now, one reading of that would be the schools forum role is to say yes or no to what the local authority proposes, and then if the schools forum says no, the DFE then adjudicates. So it's very focused on schools forum taking a decision about what the local authority is proposing. That leaves a question about the schools forum's role in suggesting, recommending, agreeing an alternative if it says no to the local authority's proposal. I'm raising that as a question that I don't myself have an answer to. I'm hoping that colleagues on the finance side will be able to flesh that out. But yeah, it's one reading of that at least is that the schools forum role is very much focused on saying yes or no to what the local authority is proposing. If the schools forum says no, it then goes to the ESFA to adjudicate, which is what the same point that Beth was making.
Yeah. Hayley.
I was just going to say, although we didn't know about the negotiation and things like that, I think just from knowing the sector, just correct me if I'm wrong, they're appreciative of anything that can come over to top up that base rate. So I think that has always been unanimous in meetings, even this morning's meeting that we were in. You know, it's like desperate times at the minute. So anything that can come back into the sector, I think would be welcomed.
So I guess to summarise, if I'm right, where we are, we either on a vote agree or disagree with 5%, or if our colleagues at the local authority say we could accept a compromise because we think that would work, then we are jointly agreed that that there's a different solution. And so we're still within our delegated powers, or we disagree with it if forum members feel that they can't accept the 5%, and it goes to the DFE to make a decision. Ian.
Just a very quick point. Movement from a 95 to 96% has a small impact from 493 to 498 approximately. 1/95th. A movement from 5% down to 4% on the central funds has a 20% impact upon the central funds. That will go from 1.39 million to 1.12 million or 1.11 million.
Yeah.
So the impact would be much more significant. I mean, it's moving funds around, but it's quite significant on central funding.
Well,
in
it
terms of
is.
what they can do
It
centrally for the support in the sector if that was to occur.
It could be, other than the proposal potentially is to use the underspend that we believe we've got an
Then,
underspend in the
so-
current year.
So the underspend is either used to just put out to the sector, or it's used to maintain the difference. There's no difference really, because it's either given back to the sector, or it's given back to the sector in terms of going from
Yes.
5% down to 4.2%.
Well, there is
No,
that.
there's-
There is that. Other than I guess that you've got proposed rate that will need to be in force kind of now and not in from October, November when well, probably not as long as that, from July, August,
But we
from when
don't know what the underspend's going to be.
no.
But also that they're not
Sorry.
taking the money from the 2-year-olds either
No,
in that. So you've got to think about that. If it goes to the DFE,
they
may
could
say,
yeah, yeah,
actually,
take it from
you
everyone.
need to take it from the 2-year-olds, not just the 3 and 4-year-olds.
And
Could
the
I-
under two
Yeah.
roles.
Just to add to Eliza's point, that is a risk.
Yeah.
So we write to the DFE and say we haven't got to an agreement today. Their adjudication says take 5% off both.
Mm.
Suddenly, there's another 700,000 taken out of the sector, and we don't have any right for recourse to challenge that decision.
No.
That will be imposed upon us.
Yes, that is.
I think so. I would much rather us. I'd absolutely take Dan's point's absolutely right. We've put sort of paper together. We're now talking of a 3rd, 4th, 10th iteration of a paper that no one else has seen, because I do think if we can find a solution in here that is as pragmatic as possible, that will be much safer, much better than going to the DFE and running that risk. We
Yeah.
don't know what they'll.
No, we don't. No.
So if we can do that, current year underspend, flush it out. Agree that if that makes a difference between 5 and 4, I think it's actually quite close.
Yeah.
Then we could go with a proposal that we've got in paper, we can say yes to, but say we'll review that in future years, both rates, and we'll do that far more with Haley with the sector. I think that probably sounds like the safest option at the moment.
Yeah.
Probably would say. Yeah, I think that does. 'Cause I think Eliza, you're right. That is a real risk.
No, I was just going to agree with you that I think the last thing we want to do is go to the ESFA or the DFE, because goodness knows what they would decide. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. So that's the last thing we want to do. But sorry, I don't know your name. Hearing this gentleman's point, it's fiddling around with money, isn't it? But if we said it's 4%, but we're using the underspend to top up the central funds, then I actually think that would demonstrate to the sector that we're listening to the consultation.
Yes.
And
That's
that
fine.
would also make the sector feel as if they were being listened to. Do you know what I mean? I don't think it makes a lot of difference, but I think it's about how it's felt out there, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, go on, Ben, first.
I was just going to add to that and say, I don't know how many members are in your team, but we have over 500 providers, and the workforce, I mean, gosh, I don't know how many. So the impact actually is greater on the majority of many more. Sorry, and I don't want to take up, it's the last thing I want to do. And this is it's so difficult because I don't want reduced services. I want everybody, but we also, I want everybody to be happy. But I also want, more money on the hourly rate. Yeah.
I think
And
that,
it affects more people, I think, adding to the base rate than it does on the other side. Does that make sense?
I think trying to find a way, just briefly, a way through does demonstrate to people who have bothered to say we don't really like the look of this, that at least we've listened and tried to do something, and then they hopefully will remain engaged. Ian.
The problem is we don't know what the underspend is going to be, do we? So we can't make a decision on what the underspend on what.
Well, you only know what the
impact that could have.
underspend is at the end of the year, but we've got forecasts.
But if we say it's 4% plus the others, there's no way for the central people to actually budget for what they're going to get, because they're going to get the 1.11 plus they don't know. So then they can't build a team and they can't provide the central support that's required for the sector.
And you run the
So
risk.
it's
If we don't, we put on the table, we either vote 5% or we don't. If we don't,
The DfE will make the
the
decision.
DfE will make the decision. You run the risk of them also saying they'll start funding the 2-year-olds. So
I don't
That's
think
the
it's possible to
decision, I
vote for
think.
something we don't know about,
Absolutely,
we
yeah.
don't know the underspend.
I agree. I don't think we should be thinking about the 4% at this moment in time.
I
It's
was-
5% or not. That's where we're at.
I was just going to explain the difficulties with forecasting on
Yeah.
the early years block. The January census determines the last 7 months of funding, and we don't get the actual final budget until July. The final, DSG early years block settlement
Yeah.
doesn't come to us until July, after the end of our financial year. We can get indicative figures of the January census, but that has to go through lots and lots of checking processes. So it's not until after April that we usually have a very good census data set to base what we can forecast those final July figure to be. So it's very hard at this stage, before we've got that January census data, to know what, if
Yeah.
any, underspend there would be.
That is one of the peculiarities of the funding formulas. You don't know until 4 months after you finish the year what your income for the year is going to be. So that doesn't help. Okay, well then we've got I think we've got really 2 ways to proceed. Is vote on the proposal that it's there. Yeah, sure.
Just one question before we do. So if the underspend, if we go with the 5% and the underspend coming in, when would we see a change in the base rate? From April the 1st? Or until the underspend?
That's why there was such a long lag with the kind of COVID underspend that we ended up with. There was a huge lag before we could pay it out, because we had to wait till everything stopped moving and we were sure of that.
Okay.
And so again, it wouldn't be until sort of July
So we'd be
that
looking
we'd
at
be
the
able to
September block.
start to calculate it.
Yeah.
So April would be what's proposed, and then it'd be from September onwards, the underspend would be split across the sector.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, just so we know.
That's on our assumption that there was one, which given the expenditure tracking, it's only if the income moves in the wrong direction that's likely to not give us some sort of underspend.
Yeah, the trouble is our funding,
I know.
it comes with us, but it's always that percentage gap
Yeah.
between the numbers of funding, numbers we paid for. Roughly our budget goes up as the numbers go up.
Yeah,
The reverse, but it's not a straight line.
okay.
You do your bit and then I'll.
It was just something really, I think there's learning in this coming to kind of next year, and thinking about, actually putting out in those papers what it means to them with the central expenditure. And I think there's learning that can be taken from this, because, I think it needs to be really clear, if we take 5%, this is what you're going to get back. If we take 4%, you'll get less service, but you'll have this in your base rate. And I think it just needs to be a lot more, transparent.
Yeah. And the other side of it is also what the quantum is. because we know what we want to set as the budget, the 1.39 million, but I don't know what it is for the current year forecast. So it might be that actually this 5%, because the rates have moved anyway a bit, is higher than the quantum of the budget for the current year anyway. And just pegging it as a fixed budget would give you that gap, because these rates have the funding has generally gone up. But I think we are pretty much at a place where if I'm right on what we're saying, we're going to vote on the 5%, but if we can just change the resolution in terms of on the basis that any underfunding held in the block is distributed to that 3 and 4 year old block.
Yeah.
That I think gives everyone confidence. And the only thing we'll know, which we won't know, because that will be from September, it won't be possible before, is once those final blocks are known and we've been able to calculate what the actual position is.
And that will come back through schools forum. So we'd be told that in that kind of in the next schools forum, when you know, like the one nearest to that would be. So it'd actually be broken down so we'd know what's coming into the sector.
Timing wise, we have a schools forum in July, and that will be too early because usually the settlement comes at the end of July, and our meeting will be in beginning of July usually.
Yeah.
The next forum meeting after that's October, so that will be after the September. We did kind of need longer to do the calculations and work things out properly before with the payment we've done this year. But our aim would be to get it out as quickly as possible before we get into a DSG deficit recovery situation.
Okay. So I think I know what we're voting on, but I'll just check. The first vote is 95% of 3 and year old funding will be paid to providers and 5% retained centrally, with any underspend on the block as at the end of March this year to be paid out, essentially paid out to providers, to be distributed to providers. Yeah, we're comfortable with that. Is that so? In relation to that resolution, who is in favour of that? Okay. Okay, against and abstentions. One abstention, one against. Two abstentions. Right. 3.
Sorry, Chair, could we run that again? I think I thought we got 2 votes over there for the first proposal.
No.
Sorry.
Abstain.
Chair,
Abstain.
could we do
Yeah,
the
all right,
vote?
abstention first.
No,
Oh, all right.
who was in favour?
Who's in favour?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Right. Against? 1. 1 against. Abstain? 3. Okay. Yeah.
I think I'm saying exactly what you said. So we've just had that vote. We know what that decision is on the back of that. That was really difficult, and I'm glad we've had the discussion. What I would propose, and James, you'd have to correct me around the correct terminology, is schools forum have made a vote on 5%. That's the first vote. What we make is a recommendation that, based on the feedback from the early years reps in the room, that there is a request to the council that we flush all of that underspend out to the sector.
Yeah.
So we make it what I want to do is make it crystal clear that suggestion, that proposal has come from the sector, because it has, and that we are listening. So it's trying to show not just a couple of colleagues in the room, but the 500 odd people that are out there, the 94 that have engaged in the consultation. It is worth putting your views forward, because we do listen. And hopefully that's more power to your elbow as the reps of the room, because there's more money coming out to the sector. And then as part of that, we agree that we'll do that tighter work over the next year to show impact as well. So I think that's a separate recommendation and resolution if we can get that agreed. And as long as you're happy with that sort of approach.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound negative at all, but that's last year we got it, you know, the underspend out. So it's actually no different to what we're used to. So I don't feel like that there's sorry, a win in that. Apologies to say that, but you would always pass on the underspend, and that has always been the case. If we have been underspent,
yeah,
if there is an underspend.
Rachel, I
So,
totally get that. We don't have to, but we do
yeah,
because it's the
and
right
you
thing to do.
have historically always done that,
Yeah.
and because we've always fought for that. So I don't feel that there is, it was always a difficult situation because it was a yes or no for 5% or no go to ESFA.
Yeah.
So we had to, the majority had to vote for the 5%. That's it. However, I appreciate the underspend coming out. However, it's no different to what we've previously done. I think learning just really needs to take place from this going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. The other vote that we have, an indicative vote, which I'll just take together because I think it backs up exactly what was in the consultation, is for the under 2-year-old funding to be paid fully to providers, and the 2-year-old funding to be paid to providers, and the targeted SEND funding to be paid. Is everyone happy to approve that? Yes. Thank you. And we needed to spend the time on this. This is so important. I know it's taken a little time, but I think we've gone through it quite thoroughly, but it is really, really important to spend the time on that.
Sorry, through you, Chair, just for absolute clarity, all forum members were in favour of the proposal, but formally 1619 provider reps and the CUV diocesan rep don't get to participate in that. So clearly it's a bureaucratic point, but I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you. Emily.
So I've got the monitoring position for the dedicated schools grant at period 9. So table 1 contained within the report sets out a forecast outturn variance across the DSG of just under 5.1 million. Of that, there's a 5.6 million pound overspend within the high needs block, and that's offset by underspends across the other blocks at the moment. So it represents a deterioration again from the period 7 position, which was reported to Schools Forum in December. So the high needs block has worsened again by 1.2 million. So that the increase is mainly across provision for pupils with SEN, which makes up just under £1 million of the increased forecast outturn. And this is specifically due to increased support for pupils in mainstream schools and those without EHCPs. So that brings the total forecast overspend across that area to 2.6 million. However, it is in line with the local authorities' strategy around growing provision there to reduce the higher costing more specialist placements. So it is sort of contributing to cost avoidance there. The remaining overspend in the high needs block largely relates to the independent placements, which is the area of spend that we're trying to reduce. And that obviously includes out of county placements as well. And that makes up 2.8 million of the total overspend. We're continuing to work on sort of the medium term forecast. We know that there's going to be additional cases coming through the system, and particularly across next year and into future years, because there is the ongoing work around clearing the backlog of assessments. So we're currently working on that forecasting forwards, and we're looking to bring a high level position of what that might look like to the next forum in May. Obviously it's quite tricky because getting a trend for just West Northants sort of since the disaggregation has been quite difficult. So things are starting to settle down, and there's obviously lots of moving pieces, as sort of Andy will cover later on within the high needs project update. So we're trying to bring all of that together into a sort of overall plan. Because obviously looking further forward into the paper, table 2 outlines that whilst we had a surplus across all of the DSG blocks at the end of last financial year, with the proposed movements in year, which largely relate to where we have been passporting some of that funding out to the early years sector that was carried forward from the COVID era, and then some of the dedelegated ring fence funds for schools, and also repaying some of the high needs deficit. When you build on top of that, our in-year overspend position, and we're looking at going into a deficit at the end of this financial year overall, and again that's largely driven by the high needs block overspend. I think that's really sort of the main points to cover within the paper. I don't know if anybody had any questions.
Dan? Yep.
Sorry, Emily, just more of a statement stroke kind of follow-up question, I guess. So the narrative really is around the pressures caused by the independent or out of local authority placements. Is that correct? So I've kind of looked back at previous minutes, and, and that seems to be the common thread that kind of feeds through.
The key areas of pressure.
And that has again increased. So despite the authority's best efforts in terms of increasing provision, and that is ongoing, that's increased since our previous report by 34. Is that right? 2.5.
So I think that the independent school placement,
this academic year,
carry forward comment from the last months that demonstrates sort of what the in-year pressure is relating to. So it's a change since we've set the budget.
So it's continued to increase in terms of the demand on those.
The demand on those placements.
Children going to placements.
The key movement we've seen from period 7 is around where we've got increased support for pupils in mainstream schools. So that's where the increase in the overspend has come from.
Okay.
And that makes up £2.6 million of the total overspend, and obviously the independents then make up £2.8 million of the total overspend.
And the idea fundamentally is to create provision within authority so that those students can then move back in. So the kind of follow-up question really was one that Ben made a comment previously, was around perhaps there's some concern around the quality, so the quality assurance around the independent sector and value for money, for want of a better phrase. Has that work been undertaken, and therefore what was the impact of that in terms of being able to then move children from out of local authority? Given the amount of investment in authority places, have students been able to move back in and ultimately then reduce the pressure on the out of authority placements?
So that work around independent and sort of specialist places is happening. It's an ongoing. It's you're always doing it, particularly the quality assurance of those really, really specialist places. We've got some that we're very uncomfortable with. We've got some that we believe are charging us too much, and we're negotiating those costs down. That's what we will do, with a view of over the next 2 to 3 years, through everything that Emily's outlined, with a big push on the rollout of our graduated approach and the ranges. We will provide the quality of provision that we need locally so that we don't have to go out of county. That's what we need to do. We are still in West Northants. We are under identifying needs in schools by nearly 2% against national average, and we're not meeting the needs of children locally in line with the national average. So we've got a lot of work to do to get the standard of education across every single school up to a level that we can meet needs locally. So the work's going on with out of county residentials, but that is an ongoing piece, and that is really challenging. The profile of pupils that we've got at the moment that we are not meeting needs of is causing a lot of the pressure that Emily's just talked about. And we know we've got a backlog of assessments, so we've got more there. Everyone in the room will know every special school we have and every provision we have is full at the moment, which is why we've got that programme to create more. So there's 3 or 4 different bits to that same package that will help us bring that DSG back into balance over the next 2-3 years.
Are there any other questions in relation to the current use DSD monitoring? I've got one, just on the, sorry, briefly on the, our costs are previously comparatively low compared to regional and national benchmarks. How is this being addressed, or is it being addressed? What are we doing to?
So you're right, we're in the, I think I'll say the bottom 20% of local authorities, the way that we're funded nationally. Through working with the DFE, we are lobbying about that as well. But I know, and Councillor Baker on our behalf lobbies as part of the F40 group, which is 40 local authorities who are poorly funded nationally. And I know there've been discussions in the House of Commons with that group within the last month about bringing in a fairer and more consistent funding methodology across the piece. We are very poorly funded for all of our education, not just our SEND education at all in West Northampton.
I was just going to add that if you look, none of us are really entitled or expected to have an overspend on this budget. But the work that these ladies have done on our behalf have brought us into a, in comparison to the rest of the country, a small overspend. If you look nationally, some of them are absolutely massive, the overspends that they've got. So they haven't managed it. I mean, we could say, which, and I often do say, we've got such a small overspend because we haven't done enough. And you know that Ben nods when he says that. But that is probably what's happened. We haven't done what a lot of others have done because we wanted to keep within budget. So that is the struggle that we've tried to do. But I was in Parliament the week before last with 39 other people, all talking on the same subject. And I think those conversations are really meaningful. If I go and say something, they think, oh, well, that's just West Northampton. But having that group of low funded councils there, all saying we want to do the best for these children, but we can't because we haven't got the funding, is really powerful. I think it went down quite well. So we're hoping. Who knows what the budget will come out with in March?
Who knows? Yes. Are there any more comments from anyone on this paper? I think, if I'm happy to note that, then Emily, again, the 24-25.
Thank you. I was going to do that one. We brought to you the provisional outturn for the DSG blocks in the October meeting. We received the settlement in December, so this is bringing to you the update and shows you the increase by block compared to 23-24. So we have received an uplift for the schools block, a very small uplift for the high needs block, a decrease for the central school services block, and overall an increase compared to the provisional of approximately 7 million there. The increase, I think particularly important here, is the high needs block, which you'll see is 2.4 million increase. And if you compare that to the 5.6 million in overspends that were forecast for 23-24, it's clearly nowhere near enough. Within this paper, we're also bringing to you the high needs budget. We've prioritised the increases against the budget lines where we know that there's significant pressure, but we run out of budget to put across the lines, basically. And almost as soon as the year starts, we know that we're going to be in deficit position on a lot of these budget lines. I should just add as well that there is an additional funding grant that's rolled into the high needs block funding here. So in the total funding position, the increase includes the additional funding that's outside of the DSG. I think the government added it on for 23-24 outside of the DSG because of the regulations. They find it easier to do it as an add-on. So that was all really.
Okay, yeah, James.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm just very concerned to see on that table on 3.8, the budget, that alternative provision and hospital and outreach have got a 0% increase, so basically a quite substantial cut. I mean, nationally, there's been a 13% rise in the number of pupils in state-funded AP, so it's not like there's a lack of demand. And then these are really some of the most disadvantaged and marginalised children that in the whole education system. I mean, there's pupils at hospital and outreach where I'm the head teacher, and they've typically got very high levels of mental health problems. We're talking depression, anxiety, eating disorders, psychosis, as well as physical conditions, cancer, for instance. Many of them miss substantial amounts of school time. And in other alternative provisions, we're looking at excluded pupils who are at very high risk of involvement in crime, and there's other forms of exploitation. So to see a sort of 0% increase on those budgets, I think it really sends the wrong signal that we don't really care about those children. Yeah, I wanted to note my concern at that.
Yeah, I totally understand. And I think really it goes back to the that sort of comment I made, that we're expecting to be overspent on some of these budget lines as soon as we enter the new year in our forecast, because we just essentially don't have enough to go round. It's absolutely not that we don't appreciate those services. I think particularly for hospital and outreach, the amount quoted here is just the amount that's set with the government through the place change return form that we do. So that's essentially recruitment that's set within what the ESFA will directly pay to you, that doesn't come to us. So anything outside of that within the SLA that you agree with the commissioning team is not reflected in here. Alternative provision providers, again, they negotiate with the commissioning team. The inflationary increase is usually from sort of September time of year. And again, that's not reflected in here. It's not that it won't happen.
Just, I've already mentioned the meeting. I've got at 4:30. The first thing on our agenda is alternative provision and the way it's funded within West Northampton, because we are completely hamstrung at the moment because of decisions the ESFA make with our budget that we can't change. And I won't go into all of the details of that in this forum. I'm happy to with anybody sort of privately outside. But the budget that we have is tied up, and we're not actually being able to use it in the way we want to use it at all. We've put formal change requests to the ESFA and they just say no. So our hands are slightly tied on that AP. Alternative provision is a huge priority. We've made it one of our main priorities in our send an alternative provision strategy. We've got a new commissioning approach that we've taken through different groups of head teachers as well to look at how we do it differently, because we have to do it differently because it's not working at the moment. And that whole AP model isn't working. So hopefully we'll see that improve. I'll see if I do get anything from the DfE. So I'm putting a lot of hope on this meeting at 4:30. I'll probably get nothing out of it.
Thomas.
Yeah, so it's quite simple to consider that I'm obviously looking at it from post 16. Oh, hello. Yeah. Anyway, so very similar. I was looking at the post 16 top-ups line that you had in there, and this is more about planning. So obviously, I'm aware for us as a provider, we've been given an increase in element 2 placements. Therefore, we are expecting to have an increase in post 16 high need students. So therefore, there would be an increase in our element 3. Obviously, we're also expecting a significant increase in applicants for next year, and I think that's across the sector. So I'd just be concerned in terms of what you're expecting it to be if the data is showing that we're going to have more students that are accessing, or we are applying to access that funding. So I just thought that was worth noting. The other thing I was going to say as well is around the qualification reforms for post-16 in terms of T-levels and industry placements, where the study programs are going to become, for want of a better word, heavier in terms of study hours. So I just think that's something that I feel like needs to be noted, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I think our response is similar, that we appreciate that the budget that we've been given is going to be overspent from forecast as soon as we're into April, and it doesn't reflect what we think at this stage our outturn will be.
So is it fair to say, I mean, we're here to note the report, so if there's any other comments we can go through, but is it fair to say that when we come to the next meeting and have a revised forecast, it will be far more realistic, let's say, and needs to be to, so that we're not chasing as much as we can, so we're not chasing our tails. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, obviously, we've seen sort of the forecast within this financial year creeping up. So I think there's been some learning within that to inform the forecasting for next financial year. So we're planning on sort of doing a very high level period one position that puts it all on the table. We'll have we've started that work already. So we've got nearly a full year's worth of this year, which then obviously informs the full year effects into next financial year. And then we've also got more of an idea around sort of the high needs project when certain new units will be coming online, and then the additional costs attached to that. So all of that will factor into the position. But like Beth said, we've got an increase in the overall budget of 3.7 million when we factor in the increase in funding that we've got from central government, plus the transfer from the schools block that was voted for in December for them. And that obviously doesn't touch the sides of the in-year forecast overspend. In prior years, we've been able to budget to repay some of our deficit, but we've not been able to do that this year. So obviously the effect of deficits is going to be starting to be cumulative from now, because that position obviously doesn't, so the current, even if you were to just stand still, we've got basically a £2 million pressure on day one, which doesn't factor in inflationary uplifts, which doesn't factor in growth in demand and demographic growth and all of that. So I think it'll be challenging, most certainly. But yeah, we're working on bringing to May sort of that first cut of what the full year forecast will be against the funding envelope.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any more questions for Emily on that paper? Okay, if we can note that one then. Emily, you again itemate the final budget proposals.
Yes, so it was Cabinet yesterday where the council's final budget proposals were discussed, and they're going on to full council at the end of the month. Basically the proposals that Cabinet members set out were basically around sort of the strategy of protecting the most vulnerable in our community and tackling the unprecedented rising costs and demand for services. So like with every year, it's been a challenging budget setting year. Again, the settlement from central government was disappointing. So we fared worse than we thought we would. Obviously, we've got additional funding that's been announced linked to social care. Obviously, that's ring fenced to social care. So obviously, common again with local authorities across the country, and we are facing severe financial pressures because of the economic climate. So cost of living, inflationary increases, and the significant rise in demand for services, particularly around adults and children's social care. We've got to publish a statutory balanced budget for the general fund. So the revenue budget for the council is just under 890 million, which includes the dedicated schools grant of about 415 million. So the final budget, like I say, was presented last night, and it followed the draft budget, which was published in December, which then a public consultation followed. So the key headlines really within the final budget are that the average council tax will increase by 4.99%, which is in line with the government allowance, and that's estimated to generate additional funding of around 13.1 million, and of that, 2% relates to a sort of ring-fenced adult social care precept within it. So for sort of the average resident in a Band D property, it's an increase of just under £85 a year, or the equivalent of £1.63 a week. So within the budget, there are some savings proposals around making services efficient, and reviewing income streams as well. So the savings proposals as part of the budget make up 24.1 million. So that's the key headlines really to pick up from the budget. Obviously the papers are available online if anybody wants to read them in detail, but full council will be towards the end of the month. Next Thursday.
Okay, has anyone got any questions for Emily on that? No? Thank you, Emily. I think we noted the update. Thank you very much. High needs.
Excuse me. There are two papers which are submitted to forum. I'd like to pick up comments on the appendix first, if I may, because we've already covered a couple of topics during the afternoon. The appendix covers the update in the additional capacity. So the King Sutton unit is now in the public domain. So that takes the total number up to 615. So that's an increase since last forum. The appendix paper also includes the Send Ranges training schedule. There were some gaps last time, and we now included the training, which is confirmed to the end of March. And there were two questions which were asked at Schools Forum in December around, can we actually have visibility of the applications which have been successful? So from an RSA perspective and targeted send funding for early years and for school age. On the RSA paper, there is a delay. So it's not the same month where the application is made and then the confirmation. So there is, as I think we talked about a few moments ago, there is a delay, but those are the numbers which are reported. And for the targeted send funding for both early years and for school age, what we've now included is the continuation application. So it's all shown as one paper. The question which was raised, and I forget who raised the question, it was regards to, there's a sense that the number of applications which are being made by parents and carers is increasing for RSAs. That's true, it is. But the increase in number of applications is in line with the overall increase of around about 30% we talked about at the last forum from April 21 to December 21. The actual proportion which is made of applications made by parents, carers, and I've actually included in the document the 14 applications made by young people, hasn't changed. It fluctuates on a seasonal basis, but it's around 35, 36% if you look at it over a longer period of time. And it's strange to talk about seasonality, but the number of RSA applications which are made by parents and carers increases in August when the schools are not making their applications. So I've tried to demonstrate that on a visual slide that shows August 21, August 22, and then August a little bit over, carry over into September 22 to try and illustrate that point. And could I ask, does that answer the question that was raised at the last forum? Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, the question.
Sorry, I've just got one question with regards to this paper. Sorry if you can hear me. With regards to the additional capacity where you've got 615 places on there, when you look at them, obviously within the mainstream schools, well, aren't they more primary based? So you're going to have, what's going to happen when they get to secondary? Because there seems to be a lack of, there's more primary spaces than there is secondary at the moment. So what is the plan for that?
You're absolutely right. There are more in primary at the moment. We are negotiating. There's a note on the side of there saying we are negotiating, and there's discussions with other providers, particularly at secondary. The special school at Tiffield will have children all the way through, so that will have children in all ages. One of the approaches that we are trying to take at the moment, and this is looking at the demand we have seen through. So the national year group where we get most requests for statutory application is year 6. And it's largely around children at the end of year 6 saying, or not the child, some people saying, how are they going to survive in secondary school? We don't believe that having an EHCP to go to secondary school is necessary if that transition is done right. So a lot of the work at the moment is to support secondary schools to accept children that may have a plan that are being accommodated in a setting in primary, but that can actually go on and have needs met very effectively in mainstream secondary school. So it's a bit of both. We do need to expand more. We do need to work with secondary schools to make sure that there is that accommodation and that provision to meet children's needs as they go up. And I touched on it earlier. We are the numbers of children with EHCPs in our mainstream schools is under our statutory neighbours, our geographical neighbours, and national average as well. So we've got a big focus to look at how we keep children in mainstream as much as we can. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's quite a long paper, I appreciate that, and there's a lot of detail in the paper. What we've added in there is reference to other sectors which are not involved in this particular phase, because appreciate that Schools Forum covers early years, school age, FE. So within the paper, there are elements which are not specifically relevant to today's funding proposal. The purpose of the report is to bring to Forum the proposals from a funding perspective, and it is to discuss EHC and non-EHC. There are some exceptions which are highlighted in 1.1, and I do apologise because I did not include in the paper, it's my error, the alternative provision. I just wanted to make that point. That was my error. And there are several references within the document where I've asked Forum to just refer to other things that we've discussed at previous meetings. So we did bring to Forum in October the outputs of the public consultation, which was to say, do we believe that the providers and the parents with the strategy that we're trying to implement? So I do make a reference there. If I look at the executive summary, which is where the key numbers fall, if we take and then I'll come into detail if I may after that. If we take the EHC funding and we look at early years and school age, the proposal is to increase the additional funding, I did say the right word there, increase, by £2.3 million, which includes payment over a 3-year period, and includes a payback over a 3-year, based on the estimates, a 3.3 year period, which brings in line with the strategy of bringing the young people within the mainstream settings and bringing them back from out of county. So this is very much linked as an overall strategy. There's additional funding which is recommended for the SEN units of another £200,000. And as we're aware, within West Northants, which is unusual compared to other counties, we do look at supporting the early intervention with the targeted SEND funding. I'm not referring here to the early years funding, which we spoke about in the early in the afternoon, but from a school age perspective, this is not statutory. But even though it's not statutory, we are recommending increasing the amount of funding for targeted SEND funding for school age children. Now that's put in an additional 300,000 into the funding. The total, adding up those three numbers, is additional £2.8 million, which is in addition to the pressure which Emily and Beth have talked about from a high needs budget and a DSG budget. Ben, did you want to add anything at that stage?
The only thing to add there, Andy, is just to really reinforce that point. We we know we will be challenged by the DfE, understandably, and to bring our DSG spend back in and within balance. No one in the council, our section 151 officer, our chief finance officer, does not have the authority to spend a penny over our DSG allocation. So when we looked at knowing the overspend we're going to have next year, we had to look at models for this funding that included how do we use this to claw money back immediately. So one of the options we looked at was cutting everywhere. And that's what the DfE would expect us to do. But as a council, and this has the commitment of everybody in the council, from the chief exec through our finance colleagues, everybody else, I know Fiona as well, we think the right thing to do is to invest in local schools now, because we think it will not only pay back financially, but it's the right thing to do to meet children's needs. So we've taken a decision. We will get challenged by the DfE over this. We accept that. That's our sort of recommendation. But what we want to do is invest now and invest in the right provision now, because we believe it's the right thing to do. And long term, we are confident that will reduce that reliance on out of county, on specialist placements, etc. It's linked with the other things Andy's touched on, I've mentioned before, about ensuring ranges and that graduated approach is being used effectively, ensuring that we have got the right quality provision and within all of our schools and all of our settings. So yes, I think it's a reasonably bold move by the council, but I think it's the right thing to do. That's my view. Sorry.
I'm just going to do what I usually do and tell you some facts which I think are really shocking. Our young people that go into special schools, 2.5% of them get a job at the end of their education. So any child that we find that can possibly stay and maintain schools, because we know they have a better chance of getting a job and living a better life, because those other children, young people, leave those schools and then just nothing happens. So we need to look at trying to make sure that we collect as many of those, and I appreciate alternative provision and everything else. There are some that we aren't going to be able to do this with, but because of parental pressure we're having from parents saying my child needs a special school. And actually that's, I think personally, and I have to say it's personal, that is a detrimental effect on some of those children, because I know children who've been supported all the way through secondary school, got good GCSEs, got good A levels, and in the right placement, they can go on and do a good job. And that's what we're working really hard on doing now. So this is what my drive is, to get as many people who could be in mainstream to be there, but with support.
If we talk about ask for them to look at the detail of the change when we look at what is the current funding from an EHC plan. The current maximum level of funding is £6,000. There are special arrangements in place for a number of children and young people, and the objective of another objective of this additional funding is to remove these special arrangements, but by increasing the banding levels. Now, we're realistic that all special arrangements may not go. There are a number of exceptions which are detailed in the paper. But if we look at the maximum of £6,000 on the proposed rates, that would then move to £23,904. So there's a banding range of 1 to 10, with the top level being 23,904, which is in 4.34. And this is also the banding levels which we are recommending for the unit provisions, which is in table 4.39. Payment protection, we talked with the sectors within our subgroups, and we were looking at trying to achieve 90%. We cannot afford 90% payment protection, but what we have looked at doing is extending the payment protection to a 3-year period. So 75% in the first year, 50% in the second year, and 25% in the third year. Delivering those lines always sounds negative. We do not anticipate that the biggest part of providers will need payment protection. The modelling we've looked at highlights that the vast majority of providers will gain funding from this activity. And we do realise that what we need to do for the providers where there would be a reduction, we need to connect directly with those providers over the coming months to have those discussions. And I would like to draw attention that we've looked at one or two providers where it on paper initially it looks like there's a deficit, but when you then look at the cohort that they have, some of the cohort are the children and young people who are receiving the higher funding, and they are the exceptions. So once you take out the exceptions, that list of schools is lower. But we do need to do that detailed discussion.
This is the new one.
That's the recommended fund. It's on slide 4.9. Sorry, I mean, it's 4.9. There are only 4 levels from the EHC. Yeah, up to 6,000, but then a number of special arrangements. I think there are 2 or 3 more points, Chair, I'd like to bring out before we open to broader questions. The challenge with this piece of work is in order to get to this level of detail, it has taken us longer than we expected, because we have now implemented the new needs profile form for every single child and young person in early years and in mainstream schools. And that's the best part of 2,000 in total. We have almost finished doing the FE, just as a side point with that. And it means that we've then been able to bring this consistent measurement as part of the financial modeling. We had to take a point in time and stop in order to bring to do this work and bring this to forum. But what it means is that we will not now be able to take this forward from the 1st of April, because we realise we do also need to do a further consultation with the schools which are affected. So the implementation date would now be from September. I wanted to emphasise that point because it is a key point. Ben has also already mentioned about the alignment with the SEND ranges. May I carry on to the end, Chair, and look at the targeted SEND funding as well? I did mention that targeted SEND funding, we are recommending an increase of that is £326,000, and broader alignment with the SEND ranges, ranges 4A, 4B, and 5.
So this is your high needs funding.
It's been changed over, which was co-production with the steering group of the project to refer to it as targeted SEND funding, and that would be then levels of £4,000, £6,000, and £8,000, and the current funding level goes up to a maximum of £6,000. So that would again be an increase, which is why there's an additional £300,000. One of the key parts of this strategy, which we mentioned at forum before, is maintaining that earlier intervention for the children in early years, which is the SENIF, which is mandatory, statutory, but also from a West Northampton perspective, the non-statutory, which is in the school age. I've almost finished, if that's okay. I anticipate many questions, but thank you. The challenge that we have, I think there are 2 challenges we have, is that this is based on financial modelling. This is based on future estimates. I do have to draw attention to that there could be mitigation. On a 3.3-year payback, you do need to look at the numbers on a regular basis, which I'm absolutely certain my colleagues to the right will do. And if those targets are not met, with the darker side of an increased proposal such as this is we would have to make changes. So the non-statutory funding, such as the targeted SEND funding for school age, could be considered. The not increasing EHC funding in line with inflation, or even reducing it, could be considered. It will be wrong of me not to mention the darker side of a paper such as this, because we are talking about an increase in spend of public money. So the other part which I wanted to highlight is this is broader than this particular group representing the sector. We will be looking at, and I've already mentioned that we're looking at a communication programme, an event at the Guildhall in next month, but also alignment with the specific sectors, and parent carers, discussion with the likes of WMVP of how do we communicate these messages going forward to different stakeholders. And my final point is point 9, which is we present this paper seeking support from Forum. And I wanted just to clarify with James that I'm not sure that's a voting topic, but I just wanted to clarify that that is point 9 in the paper. I appreciate I've talked for probably 10 minutes and I'm sure there must be multiple questions. Thank you.
Eliza, Julie.
Yeah, I think the work that you've done is amazing. And I think, you know, the fact we can increase things. I think for me, I just wanted to get my head around the proposal with regards to ranges 1 to 3, where there'll be no additional funding. And if I look at the ranges document that I have here and I look at ranges 1 to 3, and I see a child sitting in the moderate, for instance, this is cognition and learning, you know, persistent difficulties in acquisition, may appear resistant, you know, pupils will have moderate and persistent difficulties with literacy. It worries me that these children in this range 3, we're not going to be able to get any targeted SEN support for these children. And what I was led to believe when I think this was first published was very much your ranges 1 and 2 are very much good quality first teaching support in the classroom. Those children within range 3 are the ones that maybe with a bit of extra support and a boost, you would close those gaps so they wouldn't then go on to need more. That this proposal doesn't say that. And that was just my word. I don't know whether that's because if we're quoting range 3 when we're writing our targeted interventions and asking for money, or high needs as we used to call it, you're saying under this proposal, there's not going to be any funding attached to that. Is that true? Have I clarified that, or is?
Yeah, with just to explain, we're talking here about the top up element 3. So schools have funding.
I'm on about applying for extra funding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of the funding that you receive for a child through the national funding formula, that's round about the element 1, 4,000 to 6,000, depending on what your school is. Then within the national funding formula, a school is expected to pay the next £6,000 from the notional send budget. If as a school overall on that low level, high incidence funding on element 3, if you've made above that 6,000, element 2, you can then apply for a refund of the element 2 you've spent above your notional send budget. So that's where that sort of other level of funding would come in.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I mean, obviously we do apply for that extra funding. It's just looking at those children that sit in that range 3, you hope that that input would then, they would remain and then they would catch up. Obviously, some of those children, you know that no matter what, you're going to then need to go through with an HCP. I think the issue that we've got is there are a lot of schools are just continually applying for high needs funding for children. And that's where all this money is going, rather than the short input for the children that they need at that time, or their needs then to be moved on to an EHCP. I just worry with these ranges, with this document, it's got to be really clear who are the targeted intervention, how that is. I don't think that's out there in the sector yet, because my Senkos have come back really worried about, you know, what this is going to look like. And those children who sit on the cusp, I think, is my issue.
Eliza, I totally hear what you're saying, and I think those children on that cusp, particularly around, if we're talking between 2 and 3 or 3 and 4, of that expectation and it's picked up within notional send or top up. I think you're absolutely right to address that. One response here for me is, I think the launch of the ranges just over a year or so ago, I think was really helpful. It's the right thing to do, but it needs to be updated. And it needs to be updated not just in line with funding, but it needs to be updated in line with the feedback that we've got, in line with best practice, etc. So there was always going to be a second iteration, and there will be beyond. So part of what I'm looking at the moment is how I get the right people leading, reviewing that and updating that. And that won't be just from within the council, that'll be across everybody as well. Hopefully that'll address some of those issues around those borderline children as well. Because I do, it's really key, and you've heard it from me and from Andy and from others today, that the way we're identifying, assessing needs is it shouldn't just be linked to funding, but it has to be accurate and linked to funding. I mean, I'll get the exact number wrong, but Andy's flagged through his report. We've got over 300 different negotiated rates for children with additional needs in West Northampton. That's crazy. We've got to get away from that. We've got to have some consistency to the way that we follow need, not follow requests, or lots of deals that have been done over the last 10, 15 years that are still in place. We've got to iron that out and bring some consistency to it. And you're right, that will bring the budget back in line with where it should be. We do that right. Sorry, Beth.
So that as well as that sort of comment you made about you'll still have schools continuing to come back to us. One of the aims of this is to make it more administratively simple and quicker to respond to need, and a greater understanding and transparency so that everyone can know what to expect when they're funded. So that sort of equity as well, so it's as even as possible across the board, as Ben's saying. But that need to have some kind of system to it to respond quicker, I think, is key to the kind of criticisms that we've been seeing about response time to queries.
To add what Beth has just mentioned, we do have an expanded funding panel led by Tony Challoner, Assistant Director of Commissioning and something else. I can't remember what else he does. So there is a formal process, and I do refer on the EHC plan of the appeals process for EHC within the document, if that gives some more reassurance.
And can I, if I can ask one question, I'll come over here. First one is, when are settings going to know how this affects their budgets? I mean, bearing in mind, if you're maintaining school now, you're doing your budget. Your new budget year starts in 6 weeks. So you're having to set your budgets now, but you could find your funding drastically changing halfway through the year. So when are they going to know if they don't know? And if there is a change, what on earth is going to be done to give, well, all settings over the next 12 months some kind of protection around particularly this next 12 months when the settings don't necessarily know now what their funding is going to be? Yeah, please do.
That question. Firstly, apologies, I have to run out because as much as I would love a healthy debate, I don't want a parking ticket. So apologies that I ran out, and yeah, so I might have to. So Ben, it takes about 5 minutes to run down and do it, Ben. So apologies, Andy, if I repeat anything, please forgive me. Just to add on to that point then from the chair is also in terms of unit provision. So I do want to declare an interest in that my provision is stated within part of the growth plan in terms of provision. So Andrew Park, second only to the new special school, is offering the most places across West Northants. So in terms of that, just extending that question is that in terms of unit provisions, you only know what you know. And so therefore, in order to be able to put a budget in place, you don't know what students you're going to be asked or consulted on in terms of September. And therefore, kind of the recruitment process as such, that leaves a bit of a grey area in terms of how you're going to effectively recruit ready for September based on the unknown variables around the RAS funding of the individual children, even that you've already got or that you are going to have in September. Does that make sense?
If I could take the first part of the question first, is that okay? Yeah. So Beth, correct me if I'm wrong, we're looking at the indicative budgets at the end of March in line with normal dates.
Yeah, that's right. That we would be aiming to send out indicative budgets, which would give but before that, a step before that is that we'll be going out to consult.
Yes.
So our aim after this meeting is to go out to consultation with the schools and bring back the results to the next schools forum, which is obviously after April. But in that consultation, we'll be aiming to show the impact by school of the pupils' information that we've got, that we hold at the moment. That doesn't answer your September question. But in terms of budget setting, we normally would look at the current cohort and assume it it mirrors what we're going to have next year on a sort of an average basis.
But as you and I know, Beth, particularly within the SEND sector, that isn't necessarily always the case, is it? And I think that's obviously one of the concerns from colleagues, is that they are absolutely committed to creating these spaces within mainstream schools that Councillor Baker just spoke about. In order to be able to do so, they know what funding is attached to those young people in order to be able to recruit accordingly, in order to be able to meet the needs within the mainstream school. So my concern is, without knowing this information that we're sharing at the moment, we're not able to support the authority in its agenda in terms of supporting these places within mainstream school, which we want to be successful. So from colleagues' point of view, head teachers want to know what that is in order to be able to create that provision for those children that they currently have in their schools, and also then equally in September. And I know you haven't got an answer, and I'm sorry. I just, and I absolutely know that. I just think that's a difficulty with the timeframes in which we're talking about, given the, we're now sitting here at the end of February or mid-February. Maintained schools are looking at budgets that we have to submit to the authority within the next, kind of couple of months. So I guess I'm just concerned around the timeframes in which are potentially being proposed in terms of implementation. I think first and foremost, what I should say, and I'm sorry because I ran out, I think the intent around what's being proposed is, I think everybody has to be on board with that without question. My concern is just around, at the moment, the implementation is a bit of a concern, particularly around school budgets.
Chair, can I comment? And it's good to hear the feedback around the intent, because I hope that we've articulated what we're trying to do, which is investing in our most vulnerable kids, because that's what we want to be able to do. Completely take the point about the unknown and being able to forecast. That's really difficult. I think in some respects that's the world we live in. We never know if there are going to be a couple of directed children, or if a court is going to make a decision. Things are going to change. What we intend to do, and I think the report does spell it out, but I'm conscious there's so much detail in the report. We'll go out to consult with everybody, and as early as we can, we'll communicate with everybody from September. And we accept, certainly for maintained schools, if that's going to change forecasts, that's going to change forecasts, and we'll work with schools to do that. What I think Andy and Beth have articulated is that we are pushing, or what we're proposing is putting nearly £2.5 million extra into schools. So hopefully, not hopefully, the majority of schools will see more money in their budgets from September. So that makes life a bit easier when it comes to forecasting. For those that there will be reductions. There will be that protection, as Andy's talked about, that protection at 75 and 50 and 25%. So there will be a protection of any changes at that immediate year.
And that's the bit that worries me, and for academies as well, let alone the maintained schools, for everyone. By the time you know that you're going to lose some funding, particularly in year, for those schools or settings that are affected, there's very little you can do about that. And what I'm worried about is that actually that could have a counter effect to what you're trying to do. It could turn around to settings saying, I don't have the ability to be able to deliver the support that I need to these children. And while that's trying to be sorted out to see whether the ranges are right, or whether there's other assessments that have to be done, the funding's chopped off. And that's why I think that with an underpin at 75% and not a higher underpin, which it looked at originally, at least in year for that year, it could cause an awful lot of problems, and academies and any other settings might turn around as a result of that and say, well, we just can't support the need, so we're just going to close the unit. So having built up and really building up some really good provisions that you've got there, you could end up with effectively starting to lose them if you aren't able to provide some underpin where those are needed for, at least in year.
Would a minimum funding guarantee, in terms of what that looks like, so that at least there is that assurance from the head teachers that they know, irrespective in terms of, because by its very nature, children are going to be different within the range, aren't they? And therefore, what a minimum funding guarantee allows head teachers to be coming almost full circle to what we're talking about around early years recruitment. Head teachers want to recruit staff to be able to say yes to these consultations. And I think that's what where I'm coming from, is that, you know, we don't want to be saying no to consultations. We want to be saying yes, but in order to be able to do so, we need to have staff in post.
Just to explain in case that the sort of the term minimum funding guarantee, in case anybody's not familiar, mainstream schools within their national funding formula have a minimum funding guarantee where the government sets parameters where the per pupil funding can't be lower than a particular percentage. In previous years, they used to say it couldn't be lower than -5%. Then it got to 0%. Now it's sort of, you have to be at least 0.5% increase. That's the mainstream. In special schools, they also have a minimum funding guarantee. The government sets it year on year. For 24-25, it's a 0% minimum funding guarantee. So for special schools, their average per pupil rate can't be less than it was in the prior year. So that's something we could model and look at for SEN units.
I think that the premises is exactly the one that was being talked about around the early years colleagues from an authority perspective, isn't it? In order to be able to get teachers or support staff in post on permanent contracts, not offering them fixed term contracts because we're not necessarily sure on potentially the needs of the students coming in. I think just provides a bit of assurance, particularly around recruitment, and therefore how we respond to consultations. Sorry. After sorry.
Yeah, so I'm obviously looking at it again from the FE sector point of view, and I just wanted to note that in section 4, where you've confirmed about FE being phase 3 of the project, I think it's a really sensible decision to be made, considering that the size of this piece of work and how different colleges are to schools. I think is that the implementation issue for FE. I think it's going to be really, really critical that those bands that are decided for us are real and meaningful to our students, because of course at the moment the way that we are funded, and it links again to the targeted SEND funding, which when you talk to other colleges and you start to say that, they don't know what you're talking about, because that's obviously a very local term that we've developed. But I suppose the thing is at the moment we have flexibility within our funding agreement model to respond to students' needs and recruit high needs students and reduce support for those with plans very flexibly. And we don't want to fall into the difficulty of our specialist staff focusing on applying on an individual basis for young people that have come to us through the system that, as Ben mentions, may not have been identified early enough. So they've landed with us at college with needs that we are just finding out about, when actually that resource should be focused on supporting the students as it is. So that's kind of what I wanted to just throw in there. It's about getting the implementation right. And I really appreciate the fact that we're in phase 3, because you'll learn a lot, won't you, through the previous work, and you'll benefit from that. Hopefully, for our students, that's the main thing. Okay.
Can I
Yes,
just
please
respond?
do.
The move to put FE as phase 3 was in co-production with the representative of the sector. FE were also part of phase 1, which sounds counterintuitive, but what we did as phase 1 is we analysed data around FE students, the FE cohort, and there were so many different outliers and so many different challenges that we then decided, let's move it forward. And that's why in conjunction with the sector, we moved FE back. But the proposal is that when we have looked at the implementation for early years and for school age, we will then go through a similar process from an FE perspective and bring a paper to Schools Forum. I don't want to put a timeline on that. Should just say a little bit later down the line, because we need to do this urgent work. If that's
because it's the report itself. When you're not, because I don't work in early years or primary or secondary, it's difficult to vote on some or to put a view forward on a sector that you don't work in. So it's just about being clear that, you know, I probably would abstain from any kind of decision on it, but obviously I would welcome further recommendations further down the line when we get to that stage. in regards to further education.
Great, thank you, thanks, Thomas. Dan?
Sorry, and again, apologies for having to run out. And Eliza, I just caught the back end of your point that you were making. So I think we probably disagree on the point based on what I kind of heard, but I accept I didn't hear the first part. And it's just around targeted SEND funding. I just wanted to talk about that just a little. So the targeted SEND funding was previously known as what was high needs funding. And the purpose of that high needs funding was to address the needs of young people that were beyond the notional SEND funding of £6,000 at school receive, and potentially not going to a statement or an EHCP as it was potentially known, those of us that have been within the SEND sector many years ago. I think the way in which the kind of unilateral decision has been made around targeted SEND funding, I think firstly it was a phraseology, but then it's what underpinned that. So now there is a 2-year limit, for want of a better phrase, with a caveat of a third year should it be required. And I think there is a point 5.9 that WNC believe that there's a direct correlation between the provision of early intervention targeted SEND funding and the reduction level of EHCPs. I don't think the data supports that in the first instance. So targeted funding started in September. So any applications that were made from September 23 that were beyond those 2 years were then being declined and being put forward to then a request for statutory assessment. So if I draw your attention to, excuse me, my papers are all out of order now, to one with the HEP applications. What one's that, sorry? If you look at the applications, there we go, sorry. So page 67, so the request for statutory assessments, and if you look at October, November 23, they're actually the highest they've ever been. So therefore, the point around 5.9, again, there could be multiple factors that contribute to that, but I would say in relation to the targeted SEND funding, it was then placing schools in a position where they couldn't then go back to targeted funding because it was declined. And therefore, as a byproduct and what the data supports, is that then has there been a significant increase in requests for statutory assessments. Should that be a continued trend, I would suggest based on the data in front of us, we would then have more children with EHCPs if it would continue to follow that trend, which then, as a consequence, increases the number of children with EHCPs. And then we go full circle in terms of the limit on school places as well. So I know there's lots of, I accept that there's a hypothesis there based on 2 months worth of data. However, in the here and now, that's what's in front of us. And so the 2 points I'm getting to is firstly, based on that data, we need to be aware of that because there's going to be increased pressure on EHCPs. The second point would be actually, I still believe that there is a band of children that don't require EHCPs, but they need more support than the notional SEND funding. And that need doesn't go away after 2 years. So if I create a character, we've got little Bob, who may have ADHD, is always going to have ADHD. And he may need that extra bit of support beyond the 6,000, but he doesn't need to go to an EHCP. What is going to happen to Bob when that targeted SEND funding goes? And so what may happen is, sorry, I'm so sorry. So what happens is little Bob, I'm making massive generalizations, he starts getting himself into trouble because he hasn't got the level of support anymore. Potentially leads to behavior. Then we look at suspensions, etc., PXs and so on. And again, massive generalizations. However, that is my issue with when we start time limiting. And in effect, then we're create more work for ourselves. So they're the 2 points. I don't know if you want to kind of digest them or pick them off or whatever you want to do.
Thanks, Dan. I think the first point and that 5.9 comment, what we've seen, certainly if we look at other local areas, if we look at local areas who are managing this very well at the moment, there is definitely a correlation between people applying and using early funding early, so we'll call it targeted SEND funding early, and reducing the HCPs. What we sadly see is, obviously would never name names, we know there is a cohort of schools within West Northants that won't put the early intervention in, that will just send anyone with an additional need to apply for an EHCP. when it's done right, that targeted send funding, especially when it's really early, as soon as possible. So it links back to ranges around identification and assessment. When it's done right, it can have a correlation to reducing the number of EHCPs, which means we have EHCPs that are appropriate. It's part of that graduated approach. It's part of that model. So certainly when we're looking at other local areas and looking at the data over the last 2, 3, 5 years, I'm happy that's that correlation there. We've got to get that early intervention right and that targeted send funding right. On the second point you make, I completely understand what you're saying there. The model here is that we are talking about targeted funding being time limited, because it is targeted to work with that young person and any adults attached to that young person to understand individual need, to put the right provision in and to have the right provision that will meet that need going forwards. That's the model, that's the idea. That's not an uncommon model, that's not a West Northampton model at all. That's a very consistent model across a lot of places. But absolutely get your point, there will be some young people that will need that support going on. So now we talk about a third year, whether that's something we need to look at that tipping over of actually that being beyond 3 years or not. I'm very happy to take that away and talk to colleagues about that model, what that would look like. I don't know if Beth could, because I think
Yeah, I'm not sure if you heard my response, Dan. But where you're spending on that sort of high incidence, low level send, and you've spent on element 2 beyond your notional send budget, then you're able to apply for more funding to refund that spend on element 2. That's part of our policy. Every authority has to have a policy, and that's ours. Some authorities will only fund 20% of that spend, or they might look at the proportions of pupils across their area. So, for example, if the notional send is sort of 20% being spent on 20% of the cohort, but other schools have 10% across the area as an average. It's kind of all in the high needs guidance that the government have produced to say, look at how you are setting your notional send budget, look at your policy, and there's quite a bit of information in there. We currently have a policy that where we agree with that the spend has been necessary for those pupils, we will refund anything that you spent on element 2.
So you'll increase, in effect,
the notional send. Yeah.
I guess the difficulty with that, Beth, is that, and if I refer to point 5.25, that linking funding rates to send ranges, school determined £6,000. So when you go through a typical application, you have to demonstrate the first £6,000 that you've spent in order to then access further funding. I go down on to point 3, the holistic school's notional send budget has been fully used. So what we're saying that in order to be able to do that for little Bob or Billy, I can't remember the name, is that the school then needs to demonstrate how they've spent all of their notional send. Because for some schools, that's a significant task. I won't talk for secondary colleagues. Notional send in secondary school may be something like £600,000, £700,000. In a primary, it may be £250,000. It's very difficult, and it's timing. If you have to do that, that's a very difficult task to do.
Very often it relates to teaching assistants in the classroom, doesn't it? So we get budgets and we look at your budgets as part of the annual cycle for our maintained schools. It's quite easy to demonstrate your spend on special assistants in the classroom.
I'd be really interested to see how that model would need to be, because as a head teacher, ask me how to prove how I've spent 200 grand, 300 grand, for example. What do? I go, well, I've got £300,000 and I've got 20 teaching assistants, and that's where I spent £300,000. It doesn't seem coming back to in terms of being coordinated, being aligned, being standardized. It doesn't feel like that matches that, if that makes sense. It just seems like all of a sudden it's
doing it. We can't just sort of say, oh, we're back to that kind of, we say we need more money, there you go. There's got to be some kind of checking and process and probity over these funds that we're spending. So I don't
surely that's what the continuation of funding does, doesn't it? When you apply to continue funding, and that's my point around time limiting something, when you apply to continue funding, that's exactly that measure that you're asking for. And that's my issue with something being time limited. You're asking for a measure in terms of ensuring that there is impact. That mechanism was in place. And I agree with Ben. It might not make me, very, have many friends. There are people that abuse that system, but there are also lots of schools that don't. And my fear is for that little Bob who only gets to the end of 2 years, is able to demonstrate the continuation through the funding mechanisms and the avenues that are there, but the system is set up as such that the funding then stops. And so that's my concern, is that you're then saying, right, okay, schools are going to have to demonstrate how they're spending significant amounts of money.
I don't buy that you can't tell me how you've spent your funding. I think you submit a consolidated financial reporting statement each year. You know how it's split. You can very easily demonstrate your spend.
I think I do have to agree a little bit with you there, Beth, because, I'd love to be able to have £200,000 notional cent. I think the thing is, my worry is just those children that fall in between, that, like you say, the Bobs of this world. But if I didn't have enough money, I would make sure I use my notional cent. And then when my notional cent's gone, I will be banging the door down. And that's what I do. And I think that's what it is. I very rarely have to put in for a top up, but I have been putting in top ups because I'm not able to meet those children's needs. So I think that the thing that you're saying, Dan, is right, though. I think there are certain children that are going to need that level of support throughout their primary, for instance, or however. Their difficulties don't necessarily equate to an EHCP plan, but actually what we're saying is they may need an EHCP plan, but their funding might be very low on the banding because they don't need like the full-time support or a specialist provision, but they're going to need something. So that's where you're right. EHCPs could probably go up from this.
And the problem with that coming, in terms of admissions point of view, as soon as that child's got an EHCP, that admissions, pressure on the authority is massive, because all of a sudden you've got parental preference, which was Councillor Baker's point, and the legalities around what that looks like. So actually what I'm trying to do is to prevent those pressures. That's what I'm trying, my point is around.
It's that
I don't know
group in the middle, isn't it? That's what we're talking about.
We've got secondary colleagues around, but I know secondary is a slightly different beast, isn't it? Because you've got 1,500 children, and your notional send, as I said, is a massive amount. I know that typically funding from secondary is a lot less. I understand that, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we have to agree to disagree, Beth, and that's fine. But I do worry about little Bob in this funding system, and I don't know how we necessarily get around that, because with the absolute intention of ensuring that those EHCP numbers don't increase.
Obviously, I can't answer all that, and I totally understand the concerns. Just want to be clear about some of my comments, I suppose, around EHCP. I'm definitely not saying I don't want any more. What I want to do is not have a system, and this is the national system, we are part of it, where EHCPs are seen as the golden ticket. You get one, you get what you want, because there's nothing else. What we're trying to do is say we're investing in an approach which is tiered, so you don't have to chase an EHCP as the only thing that's out there to get support, because actually your quality first teaching in your local primary school that you can walk to down the road with everyone else in your town, village, will have the right quality of provision to meet your additional need. That's what we've got to try and get to. So we will have more EHCPs. I just want them to be the appropriate and the right ones. I want us to have more young people who we can go right the way back to the beginning. Rachel and colleagues across early years are being supported well enough. They can identify those needs early. Those young people are coming into statutory school age where we know about any additional need already, and we've got the right package of support from day one. I think that's where we set young people off on the right path. That's my bit. So just being clear, this isn't about stopping EHCPs. It's about getting the right proportion and the right young people to have them, and then the right proportion of young people having that sense of support in schools. That's the idea. And trying to bring the consistency to it, not having 350 different ways we've agreed additional top-up funding with our schools. Still can't get over that number. Sorry.
I think everyone agrees and can agree, I would hope, on the consistency of funding across the approaches. As I mentioned earlier, my concern is the timing of it and the implementation of it. in terms of in relation to budget years, where there are areas where settings would be disadvantaged by it. And that would be a proposal. And Sam mentioned your 2-year limit on the targeted funding could end up doing exactly the opposite of what you're trying to do, which is just force parents into EHCPs or seeking those, which will increase the workload and potentially increase the cost of that. Are there? Oh, Rachel, thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, is this not a ranges issue though? Because when we're looking at the ranges, we're looking at 4 and 5 being equivalent to EHCP, and the rate.
Yeah.
So and then we're also saying, but to get targeted SEND funding, you need to be in range 4 and 5. So they're the same. So is this not a ranges issue? Because then it's confusing to know, well, if my child is sitting within ranges 4 and 5, am I going to go for targeted SEND funding, or am I going to go for an EHCP?
I think we'll need to take that back to the high needs team and get you
Yeah, because
it's Anne Wakeling that's really the expert in that
I think
area,
those
so
levels
we'll
of little
get that back
Bobby are right. There needs to be support for little Bob, absolutely. But then I'd be thinking, well, yeah, I think there's the levels within the ranges that are perhaps need to be addressed.
Because what it inevitably does is force you to an EHCP.
Yeah, it
doesn't
does. It does. Yeah, because I'm not going to get funding for him, so he's got to be sitting in level range 4. So I might as well go for an EHCP.
Which then invertedly, in terms of pressure on settings, to apply for go through the RSA process, potentially looking at cost to school to get private services in, i.e. EP and so on, to get a report that you need to submit in terms of RSA, or at least to be successful, have a good chance of being successful. There's the time it's taking on Senkos in order to be able to do that. And that, to write one of those takes a significant amount of time. And so all of this is applying more and more pressure onto colleagues that really want to be supporting those children. And so I do have and we talked about, there are now panels in place in terms of making these judgments, and it was pleasing to see in point 4.11 that there is then going to be an appeals process, because that hasn't never been in place. So that's really important to see that. The only question around that is just to ensure that that's independent.
Sorry, on that point, Dan, this is the appeals process does exist, but it's from a special schools perspective, it's an expansion. So it was in place, but not.
Yeah, so if your funding was refused, that was it, wasn't it, really?
I think you're absolutely right. They're going back to that point. If you read these ranges, that's why I brought them in. A lot of the children that sit in range 3 are the children that need that ongoing support, but don't necessarily need the HCP. So the ranges are not reflecting this. That's where it's.
And the issue with the panel is that sometimes it's down to how it's written, isn't it?
It is.
And therefore,
whether you quote
it can be turned down, yet you've got that need, and there was never that kind of pushback.
Yeah.
So, ultimately that's what we're looking for. We're looking at a coherent system that everybody's aware of, but allows challenge from both sides.
Yeah.
And it's done in a transparent fashion. And I guess that's, what I see we're working to. I'll come back to that reoccurring theme around implementation. I just don't know if we are there now, or to be honest with you, Andy, if we're going to be there in September, based on, and it's only my personal feeling. So, I accept that that's, subjective.
Can I respond on I think there were two cohorts which we refer to as cusp or borderline. So, because I want to take these points away, and I'm the representative here, so, but I'm not the expert. So we're talking about children, young people who would, from a ranges perspective, it will be a range 3. So can we revisit that topic? And and I think Ben committed to already revisiting the topic for the beyond 2 years for targeted SEND funding for some child or young person who may not have a successful application for an EHCP but still need some support. Are those the two? Those
And I don't-
two,
I-
two whole cohorts.
I don't think we're necessarily saying that there is a negative connotation attached to that complex need of those of little Bobby. Because little Bobby may be extremely successful and go into the workplace and all of those things that Councillor Baker has spoken about, but it doesn't need to have an EHCP and it doesn't need to be in a special school. So he may be working at greater depth, but the reason he's working at greater depth is because he's got a support package around him. And so for me, in order to be able to really push through what the visionary agenda is in terms of young people going into the workplace, I am worried about little Bobby.
Andy, you'll take those points away.
Yeah, yes, Chair. Those are the two groups which I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for the questions.
Any other questions on this?
Sorry, Chair, just for outcomes, in terms of funding because obviously that was one of the things that go full circle.
Yeah.
What was the agreed kind of outcome of that in terms of schools being aware of budget allocations and so on? Because obviously that's a big thing. Sorry.
So we're going out to consult before May, but as part of that consultation, which will go out before the end of March, that should have indicative budget figures for schools in there. The impact, yeah.
And will those students that are now based on RAS funding, will they already been allocated based on that? So when those numbers go out, will they?
So the aim of that work will be for those pupils where we've got the new form and the new RAS number, we'll be able to show what they will move to. The only difficulty is if there are any schools where we don't have all of the RAS scores for all of the pupils. But that's part of what we've got to do after this meeting.
In preparation for May.
To take it out, yeah.
We are doing a detailed audit to make sure there are no gaps. That's one of the must-haves we're doing at the moment.
And I would just with that urge you, I know we're not have any votes on this other than we are asked to support some changes, is if you have settings that have, and you might not when it's all said and done, but if you have settings, they're going to have a significant in-year issue, as in the next 24-25 issue, that you look at that underpin, because if it's significant, 75% won't help. There might not be any by the time you've looked at it, but that you look again at that at least in that financial year that we'll be in.
Yeah, but from the modelling we've done, looking at those schools who it sort of gives us an indication that there might be a loss. There are often these pupils in there that require a much higher level of funding, and they're not going to change. They're not going to be on the RAS system. So we need to go through a process of recasting it without those children in there. And I think there'll be a lot less that are losing.
Well, yeah, I hope so, because that 40 settings alarm me. But as you
Some
say,
of those are £19, so it's a range.
Yeah. Okay. Any other points? Any other questions? Thank you. We don't have a vote on this, so we can move on.
Well, I mean, I think
Forum is being asked to support the consultation. The discussion has been more granular than that. The forum has identified a couple of areas where it highlighted them as potential risks, and I think wanted further consideration to be given. That may stand as the forum's comments on what's put before it, if that's reflects.
Yeah, I think it does. Yes, thank you. Forward plan.
Thank you, Chair. The agenda presents the proposed meeting dates for the forum in 24-25, which follow the standard pattern, and then the agenda also presents the notional business for those meetings, which reflects the standing agenda items and the key tasks that the forum has to perform at particular points during the year. It's all standard, reflects established practice. I hope it's straightforward, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions from anyone on that? No, that looks fine.
Sorry, can I just say,
Yeah, could you?
I know it's on the agenda, but just that there may be some consideration that that early years funding outcome of that consultation is moved to an earlier point if we, if we have any success.
Yeah.
I know we spoke at last forum that, schools, primary and secondary, get their budgets 9 months to a year in advance, and we're still looking at February next year.
Yeah.
For that sort of confirmation. Sorry.
It does depend on when the government give us the figures to model, but yeah, we'll do our best to get it in earlier if they release them earlier than this year.
I think they were particularly bad this year, weren't they? They were just particularly bad, and we missed we weren't able to get them done at the appropriate time.
Is the forum happy with the meeting dates? No comments there.
No, it's fine. Okay, with that, I haven't been advised of any other urgent business. So with that, I'll close the meeting and thank you everyone for your participation and all the comments. It's been a very vibrant debate, and will, I'm sure, go a long way to help inform the officers of the work. And thank you for the officers for the work you put into the papers for us. Thanks.